Good evening, everyone. So I apologize for the delay. I'm actually traveling in Europe right now, so I'll be uploading this video from Paris, which is actually kind of cool. But today we're going to be talking about Chapter 11, which is engagement in e-learning. So the first thing before we really get into this is talking about and explaining what is engagement. It really is described as the meaningful psychological interaction between the learner and the instructional environment that promotes the achievement of the learning goal. So that's really just talking about the different ways in which you interact with the student, or whoever you're teaching at the time, and trying to get them really involved. And when we say involved, that could be a couple different ways, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But there actually are really a few different strategies that are discussed in the book and discussed in this chapter that go into different examples of what we mean by engagement and getting students involved. These actually come from Fiorella and Mayer from their 2015 publication. But the first is the summarizing strategy, which is having the student create a written or an oral summary of the material in the lesson. So it's basically just having them parrot back to you what they took from the lesson, just to show that they were paying attention and actively engaged. Mapping, which is creating a spatial representation of the key ideas in the lesson. So looking at kind of physically looking out how the ideas all connect. So that could be like a word map or a web, especially if they were doing something like designing an essay or pre-planning, things like that. Drawing is the next thing, which is creating a drawing that depicts the key material in the lesson. That would probably be more common in like a science class or an engineering project or something like that, where they're actually constructing a physical object or dealing with a physical idea. Imagining, which is imagining a drawing that depicts the key material in the lesson. So it's basically the same thing, but it's not the physical act of the drawing, just thinking about it. Self-testing, which is giving yourself a practice test on the material in the lesson, which that's kind of an interesting one because you, of course, create the answers and the questions for yourself, which is a little bit different from self-explaining, which is creating a written or oral explanation of portions of the lesson that you identify as confusing, that's actually a pretty good one because it helps you to identify the areas where you think you're lacking or you need to work a little bit harder on. Teaching is the next one, which is just explaining the material in the lesson to others, which as we'll go through, we'll find out that peer teaching and that sort of thing are actually highly, highly effective at it, keeping students engaged. And finally, enacting, which is acting out the material in the lesson. So whether that could be going through the physical motions of how a process is handled, or actually putting on a role play or something like that. All right, so when we talk about engagement, we're really talking about two different kinds, which would be behavioral versus psychological. When we're talking about behavioral, we're talking about overt physical actions that are taken by the learner during a lesson intended to improve learning. So that's actually going to be any sort of physical action that's done by the student. So this could be anything from, especially when we're talking about e-learning, could be anything from having the students just click on the lessons, different areas of the lesson, or using a slider, or actually, taking, if they were doing a drawing, actually picking and moving different pieces to assemble them. Any sort of like physical connection to the activity. Okay, and next we have psychological. And these promotes learning that helps the learner to achieve the instructional goal by engaging in relevant cognitive processing during learning. So that's a little bit of a confusing definition, but it's basically just having the student think about what's actually going on and how this material could be applied to what they do, or applied to previous ideas they had, that sort of thing. So it's really just getting them to think about the bigger picture and how this material relates to itself and other similar things or whatever they're working on in terms of their education goal. Kind of the biggest takeaway from this section of the chapter, at least what I personally thought, is that just because a student is actively engaged, physically doing something, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting quality learning or quality education. So physical activity or showing interest does not specifically guarantee learning or retention, which is really shown in the beginning of the chapter when they're talking about the gamification comparison, in which they showed that these students were really heavily behaviorally engaged, but overall actually did not learn as much as those that did not rely on that. When we're talking about the two together, there's this little matrix that's included that actually was pretty effective at highlighting this. We see that, so this matrix is demonstrating the difference between the two and how they interact. The biggest takeaway from this is showing us that activities with high psychological engagement are excellent all the time. So that's whether they're including behavioral engagement or not including behavioral engagement. So clearly actually the best option is if you have both, where the student is physically engaged but then also psychologically engaged, but that's not possible at all times. So as long as they're psychologically engaged, that's really what you're going for. In terms of the behavioral engagement, we actually find that unless it involves that psychological component, it's just not good. It's actually quite a waste of time. That's basically just busy work, or student just doing something just to be actively doing something and keeping them busy, but they really don't learn much for it. So it's always best to avoid that when lesson planning. Okay, so kind of bouncing off of that, just talking about behavioral engagement, this was a really good comparison when they discussed this study in the chapter where they were looking at the differences in verbal and pictorial summaries with students generated or instructor provided material. So in the self-generated case, it was students that had to create their own summaries of this material, their own information from what they understood. And the instructor provided was, of course, all material that was created by the professor and then provided to them. We also learned here that the verbal summary, so it was just something that they did not have to write down, actually performed worse in both sections versus the pictorial summary, which included the physical pictures and the writing. But also in both cases, the instructor provided, as you can see, quite outshined the self-generated. So just because the students had to write all the material down themselves didn't mean that it was better. And in fact, because maybe they misunderstood something or they did not know as much as the teacher, it just did not play out as well. So keep that in mind as well when we're talking about student-generated versus instructor-generated. Okay, so how do we actually get students engaged? We have 6 different methods that the chapter really discusses. The first is relevant graphics. So that's just going to be any images or things that you can put in there with either the audio overlay or the text to provide just a little more detail and a visual for the students to see. So that's going to be effective as long as those graphics aren't taking away from the presentation and they're actually highly relevant to what you're discussing. Supported drawing. So that's kind of going back to what we're talking about when having the students draw something. The chapter actually spends a good deal of time talking about how the drawing can actually take away from the overall lesson if the drawing is too intricate or it's something a little abstract. So as long as it's something that's easy for the students and it's easily understood, it can be very effective. In terms of e-learning, this can be really effective if the student has to do something like complete a circuit and you give them several different pieces to put together, and all they have to do is drag and drop. They don't have to physically draw the entire circuit. So collaborative observations of skills tutoring. As a tutor myself, I find this one incredibly effective. As kind of the book discusses, tutoring is really the best one-on-one method of getting a student to learn, but it's just not practical because of the financial cost and the time sink of just having a one-on-one session. But this does discuss how even if you have a student not actively involved in the tutoring session and they're just sitting by listening, it can still work wonders. And actually they saw with older students, it was almost the same level of learning retention as the student being tutored. With younger students, they saw this wasn't as effective, but that is something very interesting to think about. Peer teaching, as we mentioned earlier, found that's a very good way to keep students engaged. So it just ensures that they are paying attention and they need to know what they're talking about if they're going to be teaching it to someone else. So that applies a little more pressure, for them to perform and actually to pay attention to get that retention. Prompted self-explanations, so just asking students kind of like a call and response, getting them to explain back what they've learned, what's going on in the lesson, just keeping them actively engaged. And of course, asking questions during explanations. So if there's a lecture going on about different things, and having the students ask questions, or you asking questions of the students, again, just keeping the discussion as more of a conversation to keep them more actively engaged, and maybe connecting different ideas to the lecture so that students can get a broader picture of what they're learning. So there's still a few things that we don't know about engagement. The first is, do these results transfer from hard skills to soft skills? So a lot of this research was done around things like mathematics or things in the STEM fields that are a little bit more or a little bit less abstract, I guess you could say. So there's not a lot of research done as to kind of the softer, more abstract skills. So more research would need to be done on that. Do these methods work the same with higher skilled workers? A lot of the research done that was covered in the book were dealt with like beginner students or low-level students. There's not a lot of discussion of like maybe master's students or highly skilled workers to see if these sorts of types of engagement work the same. So more research needs to be done on that. And finally, how do these techniques transfer from the traditional environment to the e-learning environment? Very few sections in the chapter actually discuss this in the perspective of e-learning, and most of the research was done with physical students, in a physical classroom. So we don't have, the exact comparison there between how would that work physically and how would that work in the e-learning environment. But theoretically, it should work very similarly as long as you can deliver the same kind of material. Okay, so that's going to be it for Chapter 11. I hope you guys learned a lot. I know I did, and I can't wait to hear back from you. Thank you.